the 17th of January, 1945, Luzon, Philippine Islands. The air smells of wet earth and burning gasoline. Dawn has not yet broken over Clark Field, but the darkness pulses with distant thunder, not from storms, but from artillery. A young Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada, crouches in a drainage ditch 300 meters from the American airstrip, his flight goggles fogged with condensation, his leather jacket soaked through from the night's rain. He can see the silhouettes of American aircraft lined up like sleeping giants along the runway P-38 Lightnings, their twin-boom tails unmistakable even in shadow. The plan is simple, handed down through his commanding officer with the weight of imperial decree. Infiltrate the perimeter at dawn, destroy as many aircraft as possible with explosive charges, die honorably if necessary. It is what every airman has been trained to expect since the tide began to turn. It is the warrior's path. What Lieutenant Yamada does not expect, what no amount of training at Tachirai or lectures on Bushido could prepare him for, is the machine that emerges from the morning mist like a demon from the underworld. At first, it appears to be an ordinary tank, squat and rumbling, its treads grinding over the packed coral runway. Then it pivots, and from its turret comes not the bark of cannon fire but something far worse, a stream of liquid fire that arcs through the air like a dragon's breath, igniting everything it touches. The flames do not simply burn, they cling, they crawl, they consume. Palm fronds 30 feet away spontaneously combust from the radiant heat. The ditch where Yamada hides fills with acrid black smoke that tastes of petroleum and death. He watches, paralyzed, as two of his comrades who broke from cover are engulfed in an inferno that turns them into human torches before they can scream. The flamethrower tank advances methodically, its turret rotating with mechanical precision, and behind it come two more, their nozzles sweeping the perimeter like the scythes of some industrial god. This is not war, as Yamada understood it. This is something else entirely. To understand what Lieutenant Yamada witnessed that morning, to comprehend the shock that rippled through Japanese air units across the Pacific theater, in the final year of the war, one must first understand the peculiar vulnerability of air power itself. Aircraft, for all their speed and striking range, are fundamentally fragile things. On the ground, stripped of their element, they become stationary targets worth their weight in strategic gold. A single bomber costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of industrial labor to produce. Destroy it on the runway, and you achieve what enemy fighters might fail to accomplish in a dozen aerial engagements. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, as American forces island-hopped ever closer to the Japanese home islands, this calculus became desperately clear to imperial commanders. If the air bases could not be held, they could at least be attacked. If the aircraft could not be defeated in the sky, perhaps they could be eliminated on the ground. The Japanese response took many forms. There were conventional bombing raids, increasingly rare as fuel shortages and pilot losses mounted. There were artillery strikes from camouflaged positions in nearby hills. But the most feared tactic, the one that kept American base commanders awake at night, was the airfield infiltration raid, small teams of infantry or paratroopers, armed with explosives, trained to slip through perimeters in darkness, plant charges on parked aircraft, and either escape or die in the attempt. These raids had proven devastatingly effective at Leyte, at Mindoro, at a dozen smaller strips across the Philippines. On the night of the 6th of December 1944, Japanese infiltrators at Tacloban destroyed or damaged 11 American aircraft in a single attack. 3 days later, another raid at Dulag burned 15 more. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Each successful infiltration set back American air power by weeks of replacement and repair. Something had to be done. The solution arrived in the form of a weapon so unexpected, so seemingly mismatched to the task, that even American planners initially questioned its deployment. The M4 Sherman tank mounting the E4-5 flamethrower had been designed for an entirely different purpose, to burn Japanese soldiers out of caves and bunkers during island assaults. Its primary weapon was a flamethrower with a range of approximately 120 yards, fed by tanks containing a mixture of gasoline and diesel that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flame itself was thick, gelatinous, designed to stick to surfaces and continue burning. In the confined spaces of Pacific Island fortifications, these machines had proven brutally effective. But airfield defense? That was something new. The first operational deployment came in January 1945 at Clark Field and Nichols Field in the Philippines, two of the largest and most strategically vital air bases in the theater. Intelligence had warned of impending infiltration attempts. Japanese forces, though retreating, remained determined to exact a cost. On the night of January 16th, reconnaissance patrols detected movement in the jungle surrounding Clark Field. Dozens of soldiers, possibly more, preparing for a coordinated assault. Standard defensive measures, machine gun positions, searchlights, barbed wire, had proven insufficient in previous engagements. The infiltrators were too skilled, too willing to sacrifice themselves for even a small chance of success. But the flamethrower tanks offered something different. They offered area denial on a scale no infantry weapon could match. Lieutenant Yamada survived that morning at Clark Field, though 17 of his unit did not. In his diary, recovered after the war from a POW camp in Luzon, he described the experience with the precision of trauma. We had trained for death, but this was not death as we understood it. This was industrial annihilation. The fire did not care for courage or honor. It consumed without distinction, without mercy. I saw men who had flown combat missions over China reduced to ash in seconds. What defense exists against such a thing? What spirit can overcome liquid flame? His words capture something essential about the psychological impact of flamethrower tanks in airfield defense, a role they would play increasingly throughout 1945, from the Philippines to Okinawa, to the very threshold of the Japanese home islands. These were not weapons designed to kill in the traditional sense. They were designed to terrify, to create zones of absolute lethality that could not be crossed by any infantry tactic known to conventional warfare. Where machine guns could be suppressed and artillery evaded, flamethrower tanks created walls of fire that simply obliterated everything within their sweep. For Japanese soldiers, trained in infiltration tactics, in patience, in night movement, in the careful exploitation of terrain, the flamethrower tank represented a collapse of the entire tactical framework. There was no stealth against a weapon that could ignite an entire grid square. There was no cover against fire that flowed like water. The Americans, characteristically, approached the deployment with their usual blend of pragmatism and industrial confidence. Field manuals were hastily rewritten. Tank crews trained for bunker assault were retrained for perimeter patrol. The standard operating procedure, developed by February 1945, called for at least 2 flamethrower tanks to be positioned at every major airfield, with additional units on standby. They would patrol the perimeter at irregular intervals during high-threat periods, their presence alone often sufficient deterrent. When infiltration attempts were detected, the tanks would advance to the breach point and simply sweep the area with flame. The effectiveness was measured not in body counts but in prevented losses, aircraft that survived the night, runways that remained operational, missions that launched on schedule. At Nichols Field, in the 2 months following the introduction of flamethrower tank patrols, Japanese infiltration attempts dropped from an average of 3 per week to 0. At Clark Field, where attempts continued due to the base's strategic importance, none succeeded. The few Japanese soldiers who approached close enough to observe the tanks invariably reported back with descriptions that bordered on the apocalyptic. In intercepted radio transmissions, American signals intelligence officers recorded Japanese ground commanders warning their assault teams of fire dragons and flame demons, terms that suggested not just fear, but a kind of mythological dread. This was precisely what the Americans had hoped for. The flamethrower tank's greatest weapon was not the fire itself, but the knowledge of the fire, the certainty that any approach to the airfield perimeter would end in immolation. But there was another dimension to this story, one that Lieutenant Yamada's diary touches upon, but cannot fully articulate the dimension of industrial abundance that the flamethrower tank represented. To maintain a single M4 Sherman flamethrower in operational condition required not just the tank itself, but a vast supply chain stretching back across the Pacific to factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Each tank consumed hundreds of gallons of fuel mixture per engagement. Each required constant maintenance, spare parts, trained crews. The flamethrower mechanism itself was complex, prone to malfunction, demanding technical expertise to keep functional. That the Americans could dedicate such resources to airfield defense, that they could afford to station what were essentially specialized assault vehicles as permanent guards for parked aircraft, spoke to a level of material superiority that Japanese commanders found almost incomprehensible. Consider the arithmetic from the Japanese perspective. By early 1945, fuel shortages had become so acute that many Japanese aircraft sat grounded not from damage, but from empty tanks. Pilots flew training missions in gliders to conserve gasoline. Ground crews mixed aviation fuel with pine root oil in desperate attempts to extend supplies. Meanwhile, the Americans were literally burning hundreds of gallons at a time simply to patrol airfield perimeters. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. It was not merely that the flamethrower tanks were effective weapons, though they were. It was that their very deployment was a demonstration of wealth, of industrial capacity so vast that it could expend resources on defensive measures that would have been unthinkable for any other nation. Each burst of flame was a reminder that the Americans could afford to burn what the Japanese could barely produce. This theme, the flame as symbol of abundance, recurs throughout the operational reports and personal accounts from this period. American crews nicknamed their tanks with a kind of dark humor that belied the weapon's terrible efficiency. Hot stuff, dragon wagon, hell on treads. They painted nose art on the hulls. Cartoon dragons and devils wielding torches. There was an almost casual confidence to these decorations, as if the tanks were merely another tool in the arsenal, another problem solved through American ingenuity and industrial might. For the Japanese soldiers who encountered them, there was nothing casual about it. They represented the physical manifestation of a war machine that could not be defeated because it could not be matched in material terms. At Okinawa, where the fighting reached its most desperate intensity, flamethrower tanks defending Yontan and Kadena airfields became legendary among both sides. Japanese infiltration teams, increasingly composed of hastily trained civilians and boys as young as 15, were sent on suicide missions that everyone knew were doomed before they began. The orders came anyway, driven by ideology that refused to accept the mathematical reality of defeat. On the night of the 24th of May 1945, a force of approximately 80 Japanese soldiers attempted a coordinated assault on Yontan. They were met by 4 flamethrower tanks and supporting infantry. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. American casualties, 3 wounded. Japanese casualties, complete. The airfield resumed normal operations the following morning. The planes took off on schedule, flew their missions, returned safely. The logistics continued uninterrupted. There is a photograph, taken by a Navy combat photographer at Kadena Airfield in June 1945, that captures something essential about this entire dynamic. In the foreground stands an M4 Sherman flamethrower tank, its turret rotated to face the camera, its hull still bearing scorch marks from recent use. In the background, perfectly in focus, sit rows of American aircraft B-29 superfortresses, their polished aluminum skins gleaming in the tropical sun, each one representing more industrial capacity than an entire Japanese airfield could muster. Between the tank and the planes, almost invisible unless you look carefully, is a burned section of ground, perhaps 30 yards square, where grass and earth have been fused into black glass by flame. The photographer's caption, written in pencil on the back of the print, reads simply, "Perimeter Defense, Kadena, June 12. No infiltration attempts in 48 days. The absence is what matters. The silence. The fact that American airmen slept soundly in their barracks while Japanese soldiers died attempting to reach targets they would never touch. The flamethrower tanks had created a new kind of battlefield geometry, not lines of trenches or contested hills, but zones of absolute denial, where human courage simply ceased to matter. You could not banzai charge through fire that moved faster than running speed. You could not infiltrate past a weapon that could illuminate and immolate an entire section of perimeter in seconds. All the warrior traditions, all the spiritual preparation, all the willingness to die for emperor and nation, none of it could overcome the basic physics of petroleum-based flame projected at high velocity from armored vehicles that your side had no effective means of destroying. Lieutenant Yamada survived the war, was repatriated to Japan in 1946, and lived until 1987. In later life, he became a teacher and occasionally spoke to his students about his experiences. One former student, interviewed for a Japanese documentary in 2003, remembered a particular lecture. Yamada-sensei told us that the flamethrower tanks taught him something that all his military training had hidden from him, that industrial war was not about courage or honor or fighting spirit. It was about factories and fuel and supply chains. He said the Americans won the war not because they were better warriors, but because they were better manufacturers. The flamethrower tanks were just one example. They could afford to put such weapons on airfield defense duty because they had so many of everything else. We couldn't afford to waste fuel on anything. That was the real difference. This understanding, this recognition of material reality over ideological certainty, came too late for the thousands of Japanese soldiers who died in infiltration attempts across the Pacific. But it speaks to a larger transformation that the flamethrower tank, in its specific role as airfield defender, helped to accelerate. Each failed attack, each burned assault team, each morning when American aircraft took off unmolested from defended bases, chipped away at the mythology that had sustained Japanese resistance. The idea that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that willingness to die could compensate for inferior resources, these beliefs corroded under the weight of repeated, undeniable failure. The flamethrower tank, perhaps more than any other weapon in this specific context, made the disparity visible, undeniable, immediate. By August 1945, when the war ended, flamethrower tanks had been deployed to virtually every major American airfield in the Western Pacific. They had become standard equipment, as expected as guard towers or barbed wire. The statistics tell a clear story. In the 8 months between January and August 1945, infiltration-related aircraft losses at defended bases dropped by more than 90% compared to the previous year. Hundreds of American planes that might have been destroyed on the ground instead completed their missions, dropped their bombs, supported the island-hopping advance, and eventually participated in the final aerial campaigns against the Japanese home islands. The strategic impact was profound, though difficult to quantify precisely. How do you measure battles that never happened? How do you count the lives saved because aircraft were not destroyed, missions were not cancelled, advances were not delayed? The flamethrower tanks themselves, once hostilities ceased, were mostly scrapped or converted back to standard configuration. They had been special-purpose weapons, designed for specific tactical situations that peacetime would not replicate. A few were preserved in museums, static displays labelled with placards describing their role in island warfare. The airfield defence mission is rarely mentioned in these descriptions, overshadowed by more dramatic footage of bunker assaults and cave clearances. But for the men who served at bases like Clark and Nichols, Yontan and Kadena, the memory remained vivid. They had slept safely because fire-breathing machines patrolled the perimeters. They had flown their missions because Japanese infiltrators never reached the runways. The mundane continued breakfast, briefings, maintenance checks, because the terrible machines ensured that the night attacks never succeeded. There is a peculiar poetry to this, that one of the war's most fearsome weapons found its greatest strategic utility, not in dramatic assaults, but in quiet prevention, not in glorious charges, but in patient deterrence. The flamethrower tank as airfield guardian embodied a very American approach to war. Identify the problem, apply overwhelming resources, systematize the solution, and move on to the next challenge. There was no romance in it, no samurai mystique, just the cold calculus of defended perimeters and uninterrupted operations. The Japanese had attacked with the desperation of warriors defending a dying empire. The Americans had responded with the confidence of factory owners protecting inventory. In the end, the shock that Japanese airmen experienced when encountering flamethrower tanks defending airbases was not merely tactical, it was metaphysical. It forced a confrontation with a type of warfare that their entire military culture had been designed to deny warfare as industrial process, victory as a function of production capacity, courage rendered irrelevant by material superiority. The flame itself became a symbol, not just of American military power, but of a different relationship between nation and soldier, between ideology and reality. Where Japanese doctrine demanded that spirit overcome matter, American practice demonstrated that matter, when properly organized and abundantly supplied, simply eliminated the conditions under which spirit could operate. Lieutenant Yamada understood this in the drainage ditch at Clark Field, watching his comrades burn. The young conscripts at Okinawa learned it in their final moments, charging toward flames they could not extinguish. The Japanese commanders, reading the reports of failed infiltrations and undefended perimeters that could not be breached, slowly absorbed the lesson through the accumulation of impossible numbers. And the American airmen, sleeping soundly in their barracks, proved it every morning by climbing into their aircraft and flying away to bomb more targets, confident that they would return to bases that remained secure, guarded by machines that burned away anything that threatened the routine. The flamethrower tanks did not win the war. No single weapon system did. But in their specific role, defending the airfields that enabled American air power, they represented something essential about how the war was won, not through superior warrior culture or more fervent ideology, but through the systematic application of industrial abundance to every tactical problem. The flame was not just fire. It was fuel, refined in Texas, shipped across the Pacific, mixed with diesel, loaded into tanks, and projected outward as a demonstration of what unlimited resources could accomplish. It was the physical manifestation of an economic system that could afford to burn what its enemies desperately needed to conserve. Decades later, in the quiet corners of military history, the story of flamethrower tanks defending Pacific airfields remains a footnote, overshadowed by larger battles and more dramatic turning points. But for those who witnessed it on either side of that wall of flame, the experience carried a weight that transcended tactical significance. It was a revelation of asymmetry so vast that no amount of courage or sacrifice could bridge it. It was the moment when the calculus became undeniable, when the mathematics of defeat overcame the ideology of resistance. The runways at Clark and Nichols are still there, weathered by decades but fundamentally unchanged. The palm trees have grown back where fire consumed them. The coral runways still bear the wheel marks of countless aircraft. On quiet mornings, if you stand where Lieutenant Yamada crouched in his ditch, you can almost hear the rumble of tanks, smell the petroleum in the air, see the arc of flame cutting through the darkness. But mostly there is silence, the silence of battles that never happened, of infiltrations that never succeeded, of aircraft that flew away unharmed because the perimeter held. That silence is its own kind of monument. It commemorates not the violence that occurred, but the violence that was prevented, the operations that continued uninterrupted, the slow grinding advance of a war machine that could not be stopped because it could not be starved. The flamethrower tanks stand in memory as guardians of that continuity, terrible in their purpose, absolute in their effectiveness, symbols of a truth that Lieutenant Yamada's diary could name but never fully accept, that in total war between industrial giants, the side that can afford to burn the most usually does.